Welcome back to another episode of Right Here in Mass. Today's guest is Colleen Fonseca, the Executive Director of the Builders of Color Coalition, also known as BCC, where she is responsible for leading the development and expansion of programming to increase access and diversity in Boston's commercial real estate sector. In addition to her career, Colleen sits on several boards related to real estate and development, inclusion and diversity, and equal pay. Colleen, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Ashley. It's great to be with you today.
My pleasure. Do you want to start off by telling more about you and what you do and sharing that with our audience?
Absolutely. So I am the very proud executive director for the Builders of Color Coalition, a nonprofit really based in the Boston commercial market with a network of over 650 real estate professionals of color. So in my role, I'm sure as many folks know, as an executive director of a small organization, although my formal role is like leading and executing strategies, etc. It's everything that comes with running an organization, from talking with our stakeholders about how do we really advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, convening with our partners on research that we're doing, working with cities and towns that are implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So my role is really just so exciting at the Builders of Color Coalition, because we really get to be at the forefront of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what does the next wave of DE&I sort of look like for our industry.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that it also blends in with DEI, blends in with real estate development. And so could you talk more about how you got into your role and how you knew it was the one at this point in your career?
Yeah, so previous to this role, so my background is not in commercial real estate. My background is in mostly governance and politics. So I formerly was with the City of Providence and was doing a lot of economic development, economic opportunity related things. And I would say that was a thread sort of throughout all of the work that I had done up to date, was on how do we really make more interesting ideas and strategies around developing small businesses and small business owners, getting people into really high quality, high wage, high demand jobs. So those were always things that were very central to all the roles and the work that I was really interested in. And after the COVID pandemic, as it was hitting the city, I realized that a lot of the initiatives that I had been putting into place in partnership with my team and lots of other stakeholders across the administration, that in a single moment, all of that sort of came to a standstill. A lot of the business owners that we had worked with, their businesses were now closed. We weren't sure when they would be able to open, if ever, what that would look like. There was a lot of concern about jobs. So people that we had been placing into jobs through our job centers were now laid off or on just like on pause. So it was really a moment where I reflected on, what does economic development sort of 2.0 for me look like as a person? And it was very devastating to see business owners and family businesses that I had worked alongside going through the pandemic, and how to provide services to them. Also, I sort of recognized and realized that a lot of the conversations that I was having with folks in the construction development space didn't necessarily look like the members of the community that I was placing into jobs, helping their small businesses scale, and thought there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect here. And how do I sort of connect all of these like concerns and my talent and my expertise into something that is really impactful, but a little bit different, but still has the same sort of like feel and mission to it. And I was told about the Builders of Color Coalition by a colleague who was mentioning there's this organization in Boston, they're doing really cool stuff. I think you would actually be a really great fit for the role, Colleen. They're looking for like a new executive director. And I thought to myself, I don't know anything about commercial real estate outside of community meetings when a project comes into the city. And like, I was just very like, I'm not actually sure what happens beyond the city when it comes to development. And that's a very curious question. Like, I'm a very curious person. And I would say like curiosity is definitely something that's driven me. So I was like, I am actually interested to learn what that looks like, a different industry, but still taking small business development and helping businesses grow, and still placing people into really impactful jobs. So it was a natural fit to move and transition into the Builders of Color Coalition.
Oh, I love that. And with that, what was it like to enter a sector that you were totally unfamiliar with? Like there is that similarity of helping businesses and helping jobs and everything with this, but did you find it difficult to go into commercial real estate not having worked in it before?
So initially, I think it was more of the language. So the
Mhm.
terms that were being used were not terms that I would traditionally hear. And I did feel initially like I was just sort of in over my head. I didn't understand how financing for real estate transactions really worked, but really found that in this industry, this is a very like people oriented industry. And so if you ask questions, people love to ask, like to have those questions asked of them. And it was difficult at first for sure, but I think I was very fortunate in having a really active board that are embedded into the industry. So they were very immensely helpful. And they connected me to especially our organizations that we're supporting and our partners in our work at the Builders of Color Coalition. So I asked many people very goofy questions, just like, can you help me understand how this works? And everyone was always just so welcoming and willing to share and give that information. So although it was definitely rough just to like the alphabet soup of real estate, I probably took hundreds of pages of notes in all of my calls of just like, I'm not understanding what's happening in this call, but that's okay. And one of my mentors, Sandy Silk over at Jefferson Apartment Group, she said to me, I was expressing this to her when I first came to BCC, and she said to me, it's okay to not know. And like when those conversations come up, just being really transparent, like, I'm kind of new to the industry and the market. I don't understand that one thing that you were talking about. Could we just go back to that and just having like the confidence to say that, I think has been really positive. And I think that also for anyone who's coming into the real estate industry is very critical. It's like that relationship building, that hunger and that quench for more information and for problem solving.
I think that's amazing advice, especially what you mentioned about not being afraid to go back and asking people to clarify what they're talking about or what they mean with the different terms that might be unfamiliar at this point, especially because doing so now, right off the bat, will prevent it from snowballing. Where if you just kind of keep it to yourself, all of a sudden you could end up with all of these crazy phrases and terms, and you're like, oh no, what did I just do?
Very true. Yes.
Yeah. And so with that, did you also find it really different to go from working for the City of Providence to now working in the Boston area? Like, do you think those two cities are very different, or do you think there's any crossovers or any similarities in that sense?
Yeah, so I would say this is my second time living in Boston. So I had lived here previously, so knew a little bit about the city and like the layout, some friends and networks, etc. I will say that they're two very different cities. I'm originally from Providence, Rhode Island, so it's a very like small city, but a little bit metropolitan, very big cultural arts and restaurant cuisine city. And so very diverse community as well. And so I think coming to Boston and living in Boston again, it went from my commute being 6 minutes to way longer than 6 minutes to
Yeah.
in Boston. But I will say that I think in Boston, there's definitely like a very quick pace to the work that we do. We get to work with people from literally all around the world that are coming into the Boston commercial market, where like there's just like so much accessibility of like information and different types of ideas and thoughts, and it's just like a much bigger place with lots of different experiences and cuisines and backgrounds as well. And there's just so many restaurants. I'm a big restaurant person as someone from Providence. So there's just so many restaurants here in Boston. And I will say that obviously Boston is way bigger. And I think coming into this market was a lot more of learning who are the different like players, the different firms, the different organizations. Because in Providence, if when you grow up somewhere and you know everything and you sort of see a city evolve, you sort of know like who are the big organizations, who is the person that I call for this or for that. And Boston just as a one of the biggest cities in the world, it's a little bit more larger, and it takes definitely
Yeah.
some more time to wrap your arms around.
Oh, absolutely. So it's a good thing that you were in Boston at one point before, because then I can imagine if you were in a totally new location and a totally new sector, that probably would have been really overwhelming.
I think so, yeah.
And Boston has done a lot in the past few years, especially with commercial real estate development, especially in with many articles I've read about the life sciences industry. Like, I think I heard that it's become like Boston's becoming a big hub for that, which is really interesting. And so could you share how BCC has played a role in all of this exciting development and what you've been able to help builders of color achieve?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the key things that we at the Builders of Color Coalition have been focused on and working on are two very specific interventions. So one is fellowship programs to build the bench of diverse developers from across mostly the city of Boston, but also from surrounding markets. So I think to your point, Ashley, now Boston is becoming this sort of front and center city for the life sciences space. How do we sort of get and bring and engage a diverse set of professionals that can help support the building out and continued growth of that industry here in Boston and beyond? And so we have fellowship programs that we've launched for real estate developers that are a minority owned predominantly. So we work with them for 6 months through 10 to 15 firms for each session. And we really bring in firms that have worked on some types of real estate transactions in the past, but are interested in growing in scale and the types of real estate that they're doing. So we know in Boston in particular, there is such an affordable housing crisis, and there's such a need for more housing in Boston in general, not just affordable, but also just in general housing. And so we also designed a program that's building out the bench of diverse developers from different communities that represent lots of different backgrounds that are going to be building affordable housing, that are building affordable housing right now, and are really building out the next generation of the skyline of Boston. And so that's really like something we're very proud of, is like we're diversifying the types of products that in real estate that is happening across the city. And those teams are becoming increasingly more diverse as well. And some of those folks are from our fellowships in particular. One story that I'll share about from the Builders of Color Coalition on how we're sort of helping to shape sort of real estate in the future of Boston is 2 years ago when I joined BCC, we launched our first fellowship program, and we had a woman-owned company, a real estate firm that participated in our program, and another MBE-owned real estate company that joined the program. In the 2 years since that program has happened, those two individuals joined together and consolidated their firms into one firm that is now woman-owned and MBE-owned. They were able to secure financing for a portion of one of their transactions. It's out in Mattapan. They're redeveloping an old hospital site in like the Olmsted. It's like the Olmsted Green project, and so they're wrapping in affordability and came through and also participated in our affordable housing program. So through our fellowship program, these two individuals are now building affordable homes in Mattapan through a partnership that we introduced them to, as well as through some forms of funding that we were able to create inroads into for them to gain access to. So I think that's like a very direct example of how at the Builders of Color Coalition, we're really supporting the future of the city and the growth of the city.
Absolutely. And I think that's amazing that you played such an integral role in helping to facilitate those relationships based on what you were doing within the affordable housing program. And I imagine that must make you and your colleagues and your board feel wonderful about how that was able to happen.
It definitely does, yeah. We get the news and we share it internally, like, look at what's happening in our network. Like, we all get so jazzed.
Oh my gosh. And I can imagine that's also a great case study for other builders who are coming in, other individuals, whether it's women-owned or MBE enterprises, and being able to showcase, like, here's what they were able to achieve, and now we can help you do the same as well.
Absolutely.
Oh, I love that. And so, as you've been going through this process, for people who are looking to work for a city or work in a city, because you've kind of had both working for the City of Providence and working in Greater Boston, what would you recommend for someone who's looking to also kind of take a similar parallel with their career?
Hmm. I would say for anyone that's interested in a similar parallel is to build out those relationships. I think one of the perks and benefits of working in a city is that's very unique to working in any other type of place is you may be working with people from 10, 15, 20 different industries. You may be going to 12, like upwards of 12 meetings a day and meeting almost like crossing paths with 100+ people in a day. So there's just so many people that when you work in a city, you have access to like ask questions. And as you're thinking through like what type of industry you'd like to transition into and what sort of seems interesting, think about the people that you may already be like crossing paths with that are in that industry. And maybe even before that is thinking through like who are the people that I want to work with, like who are the people that I want to learn from. I think that was a big question that I asked myself when I was with the city is sort of what's next for me, like who are the people that I want to learn from, what are the things that I want to learn. And I think that that is a great way to sort of inform and guide you in which industry, because there's so many. And then once you do know which industry, just building those relationships, going out to coffees, reaching out, like saying, hey, I know that you're working on this. I just wanted to check in. It doesn't have to necessarily be all city business. Like you can get to know them as a person too and ask for their like experience, how they like that industry. You might learn that that's not the right fit for you and maybe it's something else. But I think that like with the access, like don't be shy, be curious, be hungry, and get the information, and just like stay curious.
Yeah, I love that advice. And especially when it all comes down to building relationships, because who you know can really help to support so many different things in your career. And so earlier on in this episode, you mentioned having a mentor. And so I'd love to hear how you found your mentor and how you found having a mentor to really positively impact your career and what you've been able to achieve.
Absolutely, great question. So I met my mentor through the Real Estate Finance Association. So through the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, they have a mentorship program where they're connecting like younger, newer to the workforce folks in the commercial real estate industry with sort of these really executive level real estate professionals. And so that's how I met Sandy. We were paired. I think it was my first year at BCC. I was still, I think we might have been paired in like February or so of the year I came in. So she really met me right pretty much at the beginning of the program. And I will say that like having Sandy, especially in at the beginning of that transition for me was very powerful and really meaningful. I think like for anyone that's in the real estate finance space, definitely looking into the REFA program. They've structured it like really well because you don't just meet with your mentor, you're also meeting the other mentors in the program and the other mentees in the program. So it was just a really great launching pad to and a safe place to ask really goofy and silly questions that you might be anxious to ask a board member or like a sponsor. And so I was able to, I think like with her and her like personality, and when I asked her why she wanted to do the mentorship program, she was very transparent and sort of mentioned that she had a mentor that like really helped her navigate through the industry, and she knew that she wanted to pay that forward. And I think that that really resonated with me. And having a mentor is just so powerful because you get to see and how someone thinks that's been in the industry for a really long time that may be different from how you think about things. And it's just really powerful to be able to think through and look through a very similar situation. And sometimes we're in like these isolated spaces where everyone sort of thinks the same, has like the same problem solving approach to things. And I think a mentor really helps you to build out and carve out different ideas, different like ways to approach issues, and just a different lens to look at things. So she's just been great. And I've had a few mentors. Like I had a wonderful mentor in the city of Providence, who had long time, like former city director. And it just really accelerates your knowledge and like your growth as a person, because you're no longer learning at the pace of like a person with your many years of experience. You're now sort of learning at the pace of someone who is an executive or like a director with 20 plus years. You're now like getting faster to like that pace of mindset.
Absolutely. That's so true, especially the part where you mentioned where if you're surrounded by people who kind of have like the same viewpoint and same problem solving skills and stuff like that, it can be really hard to kind of think outside the box, especially when we're so close to our work. Sometimes taking that step back and having like that 360 view can be a little bit difficult. And so I totally agree with you that it's great to have mentors who can help to provide additional perspective that you might not have even thought about before.
Absolutely.
And so could you talk about things that the Builders of Color Coalition is currently focusing on now, in addition to the fellowship and the affordable housing program that you're doing?
Yeah, so one key thing that we're working on here at the Builders of Color Coalition is the Commonwealth Development Compact, which is a pilot for 5 cities across Massachusetts to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into their real estate development processes. So the 5 cities are Boston, Lynn, Somerville, Salem, and Boston. And the cities have all, over the last few months, have been embedding a policy around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most of them have already implemented this policy at this point, and they're doing an optional diversity, equity, and inclusion disclosure form. So as development projects are moving through these various cities, the cities are now formally asking for the first time, like, what are you doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are some of the practices that you've put into place for your project? Do you have a diverse project team? Do you have any investment from women or diverse communities in your project? How do you build your talent pipeline for your business and your firm? How are you making sure that there's representation of women and people of color and throughout the ranks of your organization? And so that's been a really exciting process to work with these cities that are really signed on to this mission of like really creating intergenerational wealth for like women and people of color. And so it's just been great to work with these 5 cities and like their mayors and their leadership. And also through like this pilot is a larger research and development project that we're working on at the Builders of Color Coalition, where we're learning from our industry partners, like in banking, in the education space, and in the policy space. We're learning about like what are their needs and how do we sort of really create practices and best practices to support the evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our industry. So we know that there's so much activity and there's so many things going on, but sometimes our partners will say to us, like, I am a city, for example, and I really want to do this well. And we started to do this, but I'm not sure how to know if it has an impact. So our organization, as part of our larger research initiatives, are putting together best practices that we'll be putting back out to the industry in the next probably year and a half to say, here are the best practices. We talked to tons of folks. Here's what we see is really impactful. Here are people that have already done it and organizations that have already done it. And here's who you can talk to if you have any more questions about it.
Oh, that's perfect. And I love with these 5 cities that you're having that pilot program with, that you're really taking the holistic view about what it means for someone in real estate development to have something that is diverse, equitable, and inclusion. And I especially think it's interesting that you're looking at the talent acquisition as well, because that's one thing I always think about is that there's people who aren't going into the trades as much and things like that. So it can be difficult to almost like recruit more people, but especially making sure that you're attracting people of color or women or other minorities into the field as well. And so have you noticed kind of that being something that's affected the work? Is that perhaps not as many people are going into the field to begin with?
So I would say that there's definitely, I think from some of our partners, been concerns around the pipeline. And I think, right, like some national data that we've been able to pull, I think there's representation, and I'm maybe not getting these numbers entirely right, But across the entire United States for the commercial real estate industry for women, there's less than 40% representation. And for people of color, it's like much lower than 10%, I think, across all sort of racial demographics. The good news is that there are a lot of programs, not a lot, but there's a handful of programs that are working on the pipeline to get more young women and young people of color into the industry. So there's programs like the REX program, the real estate executive program. So they have programs that they run all across the country. I think like 4 or 5 cities, and Boston is sort of one that they always have one here. So there's a few organizations that are working on building out that pipeline, organizations like Project Destin, that's literally bringing thousands of young people into the real estate industry to learn about this industry and this market. And so I think there's definitely I think in our larger workforce, there definitely could be more like talent that's women and also people of color. But I think luckily there's a lot of work that's being done, and we're already seeing sort of a more diverse and in all senses workforce coming into the real estate industry, which is very visible, I think, for some like people like, and I know in the rooms that I go into, like they'll say like, I haven't seen this many women in a real estate room until probably like a year, 2 years, or however many years ago. So we're seeing more diversity and representation of women and people of color, which is just really promising. And I think that there's more work to do there, but there's definitely a pipeline that's being built. We just need to wrap our arms around them and make sure that the industry is ready to receive them.
Yes, absolutely. And once all 5 cities are done with the program, do you have plans to then perhaps do 5 more cities, or are you going to offer it at like a bigger scale where anyone within the state can kind of take advantage of that?
So potentially, I think like we want to work with the cities as intensely as possible, and providing them with the most services possible, and sort of scale the program as necessary. But it is an initiative that is open to all cities across Massachusetts. So if there are cities that are interested in participating, we don't have necessarily a clear picture of what that looks like just yet, but we know that there are other cities that want to do diversity, equity, and inclusion really well in commercial real estate, and we're happy and willing to support them in that role.
Yeah, I love that. And in addition to all that you do for BCC, you're also on several boards, all of which I've listed in your bio that are in the show notes of this episode. But it just amazes me how involved you are in the area around you and to the things that you feel really passionate about. And so could you talk more about the different board positions that you hold? Also, how have they benefited your career, and then also how you balance that with having your full-time job?
Yeah, so I would say some of the boards that I work on and like sit on is the Real Estate Finance Association board, and some of the other boards that you already mentioned. I would say to the question on balancing it all, definitely a planner. A planner. I use a hard copy one, but also sort of having a virtual calendar and lots of folders just to like navigate and manage your inbox, so that you're not sort of like, what's happening with this board, what's happening with this other board. So that's been definitely important. It's just like actually managing the time, and not just the time spent in meetings, but also as a board member, and like as a pretty active one, is making sure I'm carving out the time to do the duties of being a board member. So like if there's like an event that's coming up and I've committed to doing outreach or like fundraising for a certain piece, I make sure that I'm carving that time out for that in my calendar too. So that's been really helpful and helps me stay on track. What was the other question around boards, Ashley?
Yeah, how they've positively benefited your career.
I would say boards have definitely positively balanced and like advanced my career, because I think every board that I've had the privilege of sitting on thus far, everyone was so different, but they all shared like a passion for whatever that board specific focus was. So like I've previously sat on some like nonprofit boards before joining BCC. And I think like there were some boards that I had worked on where there was like a police officer and like a nonprofit director and like someone who was in construction and like a social worker. And it all made sense to us
Yeah.
because we were all really assembling ourselves around a very key a key mission. And I think like that's such a key part of being really successful in any industry is being able to collaborate and find common ground with people, no matter how different they may be from you, their work, their expertise, their industry. Really being able to find common ground with people that you're like, I would never cross paths with you like on a normal basis. And it's just such an incredible opportunity to make really interesting relationships and learn so much about other industries. Like I have all of this, sometimes my friends laugh, they say, you have all this useless information about all of these random things. And it's because like, especially being engaged in your community, engaged on boards, you really get to live and breathe and be part of different communities that you may not have necessarily had access to before.
Absolutely. And I can imagine that you being on boards has probably benefited you having to now report to a board within your current position, kind of having like both experiences and ends of the spectrum to really help support you in that aspect.
Absolutely. That is such a great point that you bring out, Ashley. As a former board member, I know what it's like to be on a very active board where the staff are very engaged and organized, and on boards where that was not the case, where there was consensus building and where there was sort of not as much consensus building. So I think having that perspective, being on a board and now managing a board and being like the staff support and like having a team that's also supporting our board and our board supporting our organization has been a really critical lens and like keeping us really hyper organized, knowing when to program really heavily and when to deprogram a little bit, and just managing that balance. Absolutely.
Yeah. And for anyone who's listening to this episode who may be a person of color or woman who's in commercial real estate development and they're looking to get some support from BCC, how can they reach out to you or how can they gather that support and get started?
Yeah, so the first way is definitely heading over to our LinkedIn page, Builders of Color Coalition. You'll probably find me on the page. You can send me a direct message. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so on the other end will actually be me. Or feel free to send an email to our email address, which is info@buildersofcolor.com. We'd love to get you connected. We'd love to talk to you about our organization and how to get you to meet the other 600 individuals in our network.
Awesome. And as we get towards the end of this episode, my favorite question to ask our guests that come on the show is what their favorite local businesses are to support. So what would you say your favorites are?
Yes, so my favorites, I'm a very intense coffee person. So I love coffee and breakfast is my favorite meal. I could have it every day. So I love Homestead Bakery and Fields Corner and the Sugar Bowl also in Dorchester. For some seafood and like after work cocktails, I love the Pearl also in Dorchester. I'm sure you can tell I'm a Dorchester girl. Those are some of my favorite local businesses here in Dorchester.
Love it. Colleen, this has been such a really great episode, and I've definitely appreciated having the opportunity to have you on here. And I'd love if you could share with our listeners where they can learn more about BCC online in case you'd like to connect further.
Yes, so you can find us online at www.buildersofcolor.com. Or you can find us on Instagram or LinkedIn, Builders of Color. We're on those platforms as well.
Perfect. And I will link to those in the show notes. That way our listeners can click through and connect with you from there. But thank you so much again for coming on today's show.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Really appreciate it.